Welcome to this first video of building an enterprise identity management solution with Microsoft Forefront Identity Manager. This first section is about installing FIM 2010 R2 on Windows Server 2012. Before we start any installations, we need to configure some DNS records, request some certificates, and configure some service accounts used by SharePoint Foundation. Let's start with DNS. We need to create the DNS records required for the aliases we will use in our IDM solution. I usually try to use A records rather than CNAME records, since A records tend to make Kerberos behavior more predictable. The company uses a split DNS solution hosting the zone company.com, both internally as well as externally. In this screencast, I will be using the following names. im.company.com will be used for the FIM portal. pwreg.company.com will be used for the password reset registration site. pwreset.company.com will be used for the password reset site. And finally, fimservice.company.com will be used by the FIM service. We only require the first one, im.company.com, for SharePoint Foundation. The other three will be used later when configuring FIM. I recommend using SSL for all FIM portals, and for that we also need certificates. In this screencast, the ports will be installed on the same server. I will use a SON certificate and later configure IIS to use host header separation to make sure we get to the correct portal. We then need some service accounts used by SharePoint. I have already created the IAM-admin account that will be used to perform the installation on my FIM server. This account is local administrator on my FIM server, sysadmin on MySQL, and will become the first administrative account in my FIM solution. Before we can install and configure SharePoint Foundation, we need two additional service accounts. SVC FIM SPF pool is used by the SharePoint Web Application Pool. SVC FIM SPF Farm is used as the SharePoint Farm account during the configuration of SharePoint Foundation 2013. We also need to configure the service principal name to the pool account we will use in order to get Kerberos working. With that, we can install and configure SharePoint Foundation 2013 on our FIM server. The scripts I use can be found in the downloads section of this screencast. Also remember that I will fast forward during the scripts to save some time looking at progress bars. First, we add the operating system features we require. Remember to configure the execution policy for PowerShell scripts. Then we'll install the prerequisites for SharePoint Foundation 2013. After rebooting a machine, we have some additional configurations to do before we're finished. With that, we can install SharePoint Foundation 2013. Remember to do a complete installation and uncheck the Run Configuration Wizard checkbox in the end. Once the installation is finished, we can configure SharePoint Foundation to work with our FIM solution. Before we can start using the new site collection, we need to add our IAM-admin user as a site collection administrator. Also make sure that the correct certificates is bound to the website used by the SPF portal. To verify everything is working, we'll try accessing the SharePoint portal. SharePoint Foundation 2013 is now ready to be used by FIM. In the next part, we will look at some other service accounts required before we can install FIM. With SharePoint Foundation in place, we can start looking at installing some FIM components. But before we start the installation, there are a few service accounts used by FIM we need to configure. SVC FIM Sync is used as FIM synchronization service account. SVC FIM service is used as the FIM service account. SVC FIM PW pool is the application pool account for password registration and password reset portals. SVC FIM MA is used as the FIM management agent account. In order to authenticate using Kerberos to the FIM service, we need to register the SPN for the SVC FIM service account. The same goes for the password registration portal. Finally, we need to allow the portals to use Kerberos delegation. Both the SVC FIM SPF pool and the SVC FIM PW pool account needs to be delegated against the SVC FIM service. In some scenarios, when you use advanced workflows, you might also need to allow the FIM service to delegate to itself. Even if you don't need it right away, it's usually a good idea to configure it as a best practice. Even if it's not required, it's recommended to secure the service accounts used by the FIM synchronization service and the FIM service. If you don't, you will get a warning during installation about the accounts not being secure. The configuration could be done using group policy or, as I show you here, using the local security policy editor. The deny logon locally might later have to be removed if you're using, for example, PowerShell adapters or workflows that is running the scripts using the service account. The FIM MA account, on the other hand, needs to be able to log on locally. The service accounts required to install the FIM synchronization service and the FIM service and portals are now ready to be used. In the next video, we will look at the SQL aliases we would use for accessing the databases used by FIM. With the service accounts in place, we will now configure the SQL aliases to be used in FIM. Using SQL aliases will make it easier to change location of databases during, for example, disaster recovery. It also makes moving configuration from test to production easier since we can use the same alias pointing to different targets. If you're using named instances of SQL to hold your FIM databases, you must use aliases. There are several ways to configure SQL aliases. For all Windows operating systems, you can run a utility called cleconfig. This tool gives you the ability to manage SQL aliases. This tool, however, has some limitations. One such limitation is that it only creates 64-bit SQL aliases. As you can see, I have one alias already configured that was used during the configuration of SharePoint Foundation. I prefer to always install the SQL client tools on my FIM servers. This gives me the ability to use the SQL Server Configuration Manager to configure my aliases. If you don't install the client tools, you must install the SQL native client, since that is required by FIM 2010 R2. This tool gives me the ability to manage both 64 and 32-bit SQL aliases. You might wonder, why would I need a 32-bit alias? Well, if you have a 32-bit application or code that is using aliases, you might need it. Visual Studio, for example, is a 32-bit application. And if it is to use a SQL alias, you will need to have a 32-bit alias during development and debugging. But then the compiled application might use the 64-bit alias. And also, the SQL Server Management Studio itself uses the 32-bit alias if you try to connect using aliases in. Both these tools write to the same location in registry where the aliases are stored. This path stores the 64-bit alias. The 32-bit alias are stored in the WoW 6432 node. Since I do not have any 32-bit aliases configured, I get an error. Since the result is stored in the registry, you can also create aliases by writing directly to the registry. I will use that approach as we create aliases we need. We first need the aliases for the FIM databases. First, the FIM synchronization database will use the alias dbfimsync. Then the FIM service database will use the alias dbfimservice. Later on, I will use a SQL management agent to connect to the human resource system at the company. And I always try to use SQL aliases when using the SQL management agent. For the HR system, I will use the alias dbhr. We now have the SQL aliases we need to start installing a FIM server. In the next video, we will start off by installing the synchronization service. With this service accounts configured and the SQL alias in place, we can start installing our FIM synchronization service. The installation can be done silently, but I will show the installation using the user interface in order for me to explain the different options we have. I will install using the FIM 2010 R2 SP1 media. That will give me version 4.1.3114.0. At the time I am recording this, the latest update is 4.1.3441.0. To check the latest update available, please visit the FIM 2010 Build Overview wiki page on TechNet. You should always have the FIM synchronization service and the FIM service and portals updated to the same version. When you update FIM, you always start with the synchronization service before you upgrade the FIM service and portals. When you install the updates, please remember to always run the installation from an elevated prompt and make sure you run it as a FIM administrator. At the company, all installations and updates are made using the IM admin account. To make sure that the SQL instance you are planning to use during installation is available and configured correctly, you can, for example, use SQL Management Studio and connect to the SQL Server. Checking the full text service property will show if the features required by FIM are installed in SQL. Let's move on to install the FIM synchronization service. During the wizard, there are not too many options to configure. The first tricky question comes when defining the SQL Server. When you use aliases, you always define a remote SQL Server, even if the alias points to a locally installed SQL Server. We have created quite a few service accounts, so just make sure you use the appropriate one. The setup will create local groups to be used for different roles within the FIM synchronization service. It is considered a best practice to use the main-based groups rather than the local groups. In that case, you create the groups as part of the prerequisites and change the group names in the setup wizard. I make it a habit to always allow the setup to open the firewall for remote access to the FIM synchronization service. The setup itself usually takes only about half a minute to complete. At the end, you will be prompted to make a backup of the encryption key used by the FIM synchronization service when it stores sensitive information within its database. Make sure to store it in a secure location. You might need this key in case of disaster recovery or reinstall. During the setup, the account performing the installation has been added to the FIMsync admins group, giving the installer the administrator's role within the FIM synchronization service. But in order to update the membership, we need to log off and log on again before we can start managing the FIM synchronization service. Once we log on again, we can verify that we can start the FIM Synchronization Service Manager management interface. FIM Synchronization Service is now installed and we have verified it's working. We can now move on to installing the FIM service and portals. Since we are installing the FIM service on the same server as the FIM Synchronization Service, we do not need to verify the SQL access. We can just move directly to installing the FIM service. As we could see earlier, the FIM Sync setup doesn't give you too many options or possibilities to make errors. FIM service and portal setup, on the other hand, is a bit more complex. The company will have all portals and the FIM service installed on the same server. The FIM reporting feature is not installed initially, but we will add that later on when the reporting feature is configured. As with the synchronization service, we will use alias for SQL Server. For the FIM service, we will use the DB FIM service alias. The mail server connection requires some planning before we move on. The FIM service account needs a mailbox in order for it to receive emails. The company is planning to use email approvals in some workflows, therefore we need to give the service account a mailbox. Let's just pop over to the Exchange server and fix that, and then we'll be right back continuing the setup. As a best practice, you should consider locking down this service mailbox, like setting mail size limits. More information about recommendations around this can be found on TechNet. Now when the FIM service account has its mailbox, we can continue with the setup. The mail server we are using is the Exchange server. The FIM service certificate is not something that is exposed to typical users or clients. I recommend that you use the self-issued certificate. Make sure you configure the correct service account and remember to use the correct email address you assigned to the service account mailbox. It is very important that you configure the correct account as the FIM management agent account, since this account will be given special permissions within the FIM service. This is also the account we need to remember to use later on when configuring the FIM service management agent in the synchronization service. We created a special DNS alias for the FIM service earlier, so remember to use the correct name for the service. The same goes for the SharePoint collection we created to host FIM portal. Since the company will use the self-service password reset feature, I recommend configuring the correct URL for the FIM portal homepage. For external clients to access the FIM service, we need to allow the ports used by the service in the local firewall. And in order for the self-service to work, we need to configure access in the SharePoint site. Just remember that this does not mean that you allow everyone access to the FIM portal. This just prepares the underlying SharePoint. The password registration portal and the password reset portal are initially configured to use port 80. We will later configure them to use SSL. Access setting we are using says extranet users, but that actually means extranet and intranet users. The company will not have a separate set of portals for each type of access. The installation will take a few minutes to complete. Once the installation is finished, we can verify that the FIM portal is working. Before we start using the password registration and reset portals, we need to configure IS to use SSL for these sites. Since we are using IS 8 on Windows Server 2012, we can use the IS manager to configure host header binding on SSL to separate the different sites we host in our IS. If you try the registration portal, you will typically find it does not work. This is because Kerberos is not yet correctly configured on the registration site. The problem is that although we're told to set up what account to use for application pool, the site is not configured by setup to actually use the application pool account. we need to configure the registration site to use the application pool account for Kerberos to work. We can now verify the registration and reset portals are working. One final thing before we consider setup complete is to add the FIM service account to the FIM Sync admins group. This is required in order for us to later configure synchronization rules. To make sure the membership is applied, we have to restart FIM service. The FIM service and portal is now installed, and the company can begin configuring FIM. In the next section, we will start the configuration by looking at some basic and common configurations. In this section, we will look at some basic configuration you would make in almost every FIM implementation. The first management agent the company will configure is the FIM service MA. This is a special adapter used for internal communication between the FIM synchronization service and the FIM service. As the solution is evolving, we will return to this MA and reconfigure it many times. We will now just do the initial setup. The tricky part during the initial configuration of the FIM MA is the connection information used to connect to it. Remember to use the aliases we have been configuring. The port number used to connect to the FIM service is 5725. We add group and person to the object types we are interested in, and leave the default attributes selected. Later, we will come back and add attributes as the need arise. We will soon come back and add some connector filters, but at the moment we just move on. On Configure Object Type Mapping, we will have to add the mapping between the two schemas we have in FIM, the FIM service and the FIM Sync Metaverse. We will discuss this in the next video, covering the schema management in FIM. For now, we'll just accept the default values for the rest of the settings. To test the MA, we add the run profile to do a full import. We will take a closer look at run profiles in a later section. We then run the full import to verify that the MA can communicate with the FIM service and also to get the initial objects within the FIM service. We get 2 users, and the thing is that neither of these users should be handled by the synchronization service. It's the IAM-admin account and the account used by the MA. In order to make sure these accounts are not managed, we filter them in the management agent. We add the GUID of the synchronization account to the filter, and the account name of the admin account to the connection filter. We have now created the FIM service MA, and it is ready to be used to transfer information between the FIM synchronization service and the FIM service. In the next video, we will create the Active Directory MA. The most common management agent in FIM is Active Directory. And even if it is not required, I have so far never implemented the FIM solution without having at least one Active Directory connected. As one of its goals, the company has to make the AD fully managed by FIM. We will now look at the basic setup of this management agent. Before we create the ADMA, we need to give some permissions to the account used by FIM to connect to AD. The company uses the same account, the SVC FIM-MA, for all domain-connected management agents. In order to read the changelog and do delta imports, we need to allow the permission replicating directory changes to the SVC FIM-MA account. We then need to assign appropriate permissions to the OUs in AD managed by FIM. An easy way is to use the Delegate Control Wizard to allow the SVC FIM-MA to manage users and groups. With the permissions in place, we can create the MA. Remember to use the same account, the SVC FIM-MA, as you delegated the permission to. The first thing is to select the containers in AD that FIM should be managing. By default, the whole AD is selected, but at the company, FIM should only manage the company OU. In AD, we will manage user and group objects. Initially, we only need a basic set of attributes. Later, we will get back and add more attributes to the list. The rest of the settings will have only default settings. After creating the MA, we need to add a run profile and perform a full import. This is sometimes referred to as the discovery import. Looking at the objects we retrieve during the import, we can see that we get the containers as well as existing user objects. The AD-MA is now created and can be used to import and export information to Active Directory. In the next part, we will take a look at the run profiles and how to create schedules in FIM. One of the basic configuration steps we will perform is to configure all the run profiles we need to schedule the synchronization service. One of the challenges is that not all management agents support delta imports, and we would in such cases be forced to use full imports for FIM to get the changes from the system. Later on, we'll add the human resource system, but for now, we only have systems that support delta imports. We add delta import, delta synchronization, full synchronization, and export to our run profiles. At this time, I would like to issue a small warning. Do not use the two-step profiles available in the UI. They are announced as deprecated and might not be around in the next version of FIM. If you search the web, you will find several articles about why you shouldn't use them. Once we've added the run profiles, we come to the question around how are we to schedule these run profiles. In the UI, when selecting a particular run profile, you have the option to create a VB script that will run that particular run profile. If you create these VB scripts, you can then call them from a scheduled task to run the profiles you like in the preferred order. Lately, instead of using the VB script, I've started using PowerShell to run my profiles. What you see here is just an example of how such a PowerShell script might look like. whether we use VB or PowerShell scripts is not important. There are also other options available using third-party apps to configure and run the schedule. We then configure a scheduled task to run the PowerShell script. The task is configured to run as often as required. One more thing to consider while working with the scheduled tasks is the security context. The task defaults to run as the account configuring it. I usually try to use the network service account instead in order to prevent the task from stopping just because we changed the password of the user account. But in order for the network service account to be allowed to actually run the profiles in FIM, we need to add the network service account to the FIM sync operators group. A scheduled task has many other settings you might want to tweak. The important point is when and how often we would like the task to run. When running the run profiles, we will add rows to the run history. We need to have some kind of cleanup for this data, otherwise the synchronization database will grow and become very large. I use a PowerShell script for that as well and schedule it to run, for example, running it once a day, cleaning up run history older than 3 days. Just remember that cleaning up the run history too fast might make it impossible to trace back issues. Since our configuration is not yet complete, we need to remember to disable the scheduled task until we are ready to automate the run profiles. Run profiles and schedules have to be carefully planned to meet the needs of our solution. We now have the basic setup to automate the identity flow. In the next video, we will look at how to change the schema in FIM to meet the needs of the company. Schema management can be quite complex in FIM, since it has two schemas. The FIM service uses one schema and the FIM synchronization service uses the other. When making changes, we need to decide if the changes are required in one or both of these schemas. The company will store information about organizational units in FIM. They will therefore add a new resource type to the FIM service schema to store information about organizational units. But in the synchronization service schema, they will use a default object type already present. Due to time restrictions, I will only show you some basic examples on the schema changes the company will do. The tasks would be repeated when adding other attributes or resource types to the schemas. The first step is to create a resource type in FIM service schema. When adding things to the default schema, I always recommend using a prefix that will make it easy to detect what is added and what is default. The creation of a new resource type adds a couple of default bindings. But we might also have the need for others, like in this case, the account name attribute. To be able to manage the new resource type, we need at least one set that holds all objects of this particular resource type. In order for a new attribute or resource type to be managed by the synchronization service, we need to do some configuration. We need to modify or add a new management policy rule, allowing the synchronization service to manage the resource or attribute. The synchronization filter is a setting that filters the resources visible to the FIM service MA. If we would like the synchronization service to be able to handle the resource type we define, we need to add it to the synchronization filter. We can now refresh the schema of the FIM service MA, and the new schema should be detected. In the FIM synchronization schema, the company will use the default organizational unit object type. But in order to add a mapping between the resource in the FIM service schema and the object type in the FIM synchronization service schema, we need to link the CS object ID attribute to it. And since we also plan on storing account name, we will link that as well. We then need to modify the FIM service MA to handle the new resource type. When we create the object type mapping, we will automatically get a few attribute flows defined. But we will need to modify them to work with our needs. The mapping adds the default flows for detected and expected rules. We will not use them for this resource type, so I remove them. The company also has a need for storing a reference on the users, storing information about the organizational unit they belong to. This needs to be added to both the metaverse schema and the service schema. Let's start with the metaverse schema. We then add it as a new attribute in the FIM service schema and add a binding to the user resource. To allow the synchronization service to update the value in the FIM service, we need to either create a new MPR or add this attribute to the list of attributes in the existing default MPR. To be able to actually synchronize this new attribute, we need to refresh the schema of the FIM service MA and add this new attribute to the flow. But we have already seen how that is done. The company, as most FIM customers, have detected that schema changes are required to support their design. Making the schema changes might look easy, but remember that like all schemas, a simple typo might be very hard to change once it has been committed to the schema. In the next video, we will turn back to our ADMA and look at the initial load of existing users in Active Directory. The company is planning to have a flow where users are imported from the human resource system and then synchronized into AD. But there are already existing users in AD that we need to consider. The process to load existing data is sometimes referred to as the initial load. In order to import the existing users in AD, we need to create a synchronization rule. This rule might be used only during initial load, but it could also be that we use it all along, but changes the configuration of it. The key setting we are interested in at the moment is the create resource in FIM. During initial load, we might want this to be true, but later on we would change the setting to false since we are planning to have the HR system do this. We only add a very basic set of attributes to the rule at the moment, since the plan is to have the HR system as the master later on. We then import this new rule into the synchronization engine so that it can be applied to the users in our ADMA. After changing the configuration, the UI will prompt you that you should run a full synchronization rather than a delta. Once the rule is synchronized, we can synchronize the ADMA to import the existing users we have in AD into the metaverse. We can then verify that the users have been imported by searching for person objects in the metaverse. This procedure will need to be repeated for other resources, groups for example, that might already exist in your environment. I show you how to load from AD in this case, but as you can imagine, the initial load might also include other connected systems. The projection of new users from AD will also automatically provision new objects in the FIM service MA. Running an export on the FIM service MA will create the users in the FIM service database, and you will be able to see them in the FIM portal. At this early stage in our configuration, you can notice that we are missing some attribute flows in the FIM service MA, making the user in the FIM portal appear without any attributes at all. Adding a few more attributes like display name and account name to the FIM service attribute flow and then synchronizing the users again will make them look a little more normal in the FIM portal. You should always make sure that the display name attribute is populated for all objects in FIM. Initial load is about importing existing objects before we start to apply our new identity management logic. If we don't, we might end up creating duplicates. This was the last part of this section on basic configuration. In the next section, we will start implementing the logic in the identity solution at the company, starting off by looking at user management. In this section, we will look at the first flow of data regarding users. We will import users from the HR system and use that as a master system for handling the Active Directory object. Before you start importing data, you need to learn the structure and content of the data source. At the company, we have a SQL table with the HR data and also a view showing members in different organizational units. We will look at that in more detail in the next section about groups. Notice, for example, that the manager column contains the object ID of the manager, not the name. This is very useful since that means we can use this as a reference attribute. Let's create the HRMA. Make sure that you use the correct tables and views for the settings of the HRMA. Remember that you need to assign the account FIM users, SVC FIM MA in my case, the appropriate permissions on the database. We need to define the anchor column, but also configure that the columns manager and parent org are actually references. We also need to configure the multi-value setting. In our case, we will use this in the next session when working with groups. And the object type is not fixed but stored in the object type column. The rest is just using default values, and we have now created our HRMA. As with all MAs, we need to create the run profiles we need. And note that the HR database does not contain any delta information, making delta import impossible. We can then run the import and look at the object we get from the HR system. In order for FIM to actually use the data from HR, we need to create a synchronization rule to import the user information from HR. As you recall, we have existing users imported from AD, and we need to join them using some criteria. In our case, we use the account name to join object. But for new users, we would like to create them in FIM. Most attributes in the HR system are imported to the metaverse. For some attributes, like first name, we have multiple options on where to store them in the metaverse schema. First name, for example, can be stored in the first name or in given name. We have similar problem with some other attributes as well. We'll store the parent org in the custom attribute we created in the previous section. Importing this new sync rule. And running a synchronization on the HRMA will give us all the data from HR on our users. We now have the new user Ken, and notice how the reference on the manager attribute resolves to a link pointing to the referenced object. The key to a successful import of data into FIM is to understand the structure used in the data source. We now have our HR users imported and can move on to exporting this data into AD. Managing users in Active Directory is one of the most common scenarios when working with FIM. As with the company, the HR system is a common source of information. In this video, we will look at the basics of provisioning users to AD. When creating an outbound synchronization for AD, we will get the option to use the old way of applying the rules using the so-called ERE expected rule entry. If possible, you should avoid using that method and use the new method using the outbound scoping filter. In this particular case, we would like the rule to apply to all users at the moment. Later on, we might have users in our FIM that should not be present in AD. In the exchange part, we will see how filtering is used to have different rules on employees and contractors. The key to create new users in AD is to check the Create Resource in External System checkbox. There are two attributes that are required in order to create a new user in AD. They are SAM account name and DN. We can use the function builder in FIM to concatenate the values that need to be concatenated to build up the complete DN. The OU path is in this case a static value, but in some cases it's a dynamic value using, for instance, department as a parameter. FIM also has the requirement that we have the DN as initial flow only if we are to create users in AD. If we also would like to support changing the DN in AD, we need to add the same flow but without the initial flow only checkbox. As you can see, we do not have access to the attributes in our ADMA yet. We will add them later and go back and add them to the attribute flow. This will create a disabled user in AD. In the next part, we will discuss the user account control attribute and how to enable the user. Before we use a new sync rule that creates new users in AD, we need to remember to enable provisioning in our synchronization manager. Importing the new sync rule and synchronizing the HRMA will create what is called a pending export to AD. When we have made configuration changes like this, a full synchronization is required. Remember that synchronizing does not affect external data sources, not until we run the export profile. This pending export can be found by searching the connector space. Using this tool, we can make sure that we do not affect the external data source in a way we were not supposed to. Notice how we will rename the user John Doe, since his CN does not match the syntax we are planning to use. One problem we run into at this stage is that we have another rule importing data to FIM. This will be a reoccurring problem that needs to be addressed as soon as we make changes to any synchronization rules. This is causing a conflict on some attributes, and we need to configure the precedence so that the information in HR overrides information in AD. Precedence problem is something that will reoccur frequently while configuring FIM and is one of the most common reasons for unexpected behaviors. As we could see in the pending export, we are missing a lot of attributes. So let's add some attributes to the list in our ADMA. After adding attributes to the list, you need to perform a full import to get the current values on these new attributes. We then add the attributes to the synchronization rule, import the modified sync rule, and synchronize the users once again. Now let's check the pending export, and once satisfied, we'll run the actual export that will create and modify the users in AD. We have now learned that managing users in AD can be quite easy, but also a challenging task since many attributes in AD are very odd. One of these strange attributes is user account control. In the next video, we will take a closer look at that one. In the previous video, we saw how to manage users in AD. In AD, there are, however, attributes that need some special attention. One of them is the user account control attribute. If we look at the users in ID, we will find that they have different values on the user account control attribute. This value controls most of the settings on the Account tab. The user account control attribute is a bitmap. On the internet, for example in the Microsoft Knowledge Base article 305144, you can find information about what each flag means. In FIM, this means that we need to be careful how we manipulate this value. You cannot just set it to, for example, 512 to enable an account, since that also affects other flags like password never expires flag. What we need to do is to operate the bits one by one and figure out the defaults on new accounts. First of all, we need to import the current value on the account to FIM. For this, we need to extend the schema with an attribute to store the value. We then need to add the flow of user account control to our inbound rule for AD. Then need to have some policy in the criteria for disabling and enabling users. The company is adding another attribute to the schema in FIM. This is a Boolean value that indicates if a user is active or not. The value on that attribute is used in the rule to control if the second bit, the 2-bit, should be on or off. That is, if the account should be enabled or disabled. We then add to the rule a flow using the bit operator functions in FIM to set this attribute based on the current value on the 2-bit in user account control. Importing the updated rule and running import and sync on the ADMA will show that the users are now updated based on the status in AD. Showing Jan is active, but not Ken. The problem now is how to control the Boolean attribute we would like to use to control the account. At the company, this will be done manually using self-service in the FIM portal. But that also requires this new Boolean attribute to be present in the FIM service schema. We need to create a new attribute, then create a binding to the user resource. And since this is a new attribute, you have to remember to add it to the MPR that controls the attributes the synchronization account can handle. We then need to add this attribute to the FIM service MA attribute flow in order for its change on the flag in the FIM portal propagate to the metaverse and onto AD. Remember to refresh the schema and add the attribute to the list of managed attributes. We will once again run into the precedence problems and need to first export current values to the FIM service before we change the precedence, making the FIM service master for the company active attribute. After synchronizing and exporting the data to the FIM service, it will show up on the users in the portal. Remember to switch back the precedence setting. The outbound synchronization rule will then use the built-in bit operation function in FIM to manipulate the user account control value on the users, setting it to 514, a normal disabled account, as the default value if none exist. Remember that you cannot clear the 2-bit, enabling the account on a new user unless you also provide an initial password for the user. The company creates the users as disabled account and has separate process for setting the initial password and enabling the account. The user account control is a common example on AD attributes that are almost always part of the FIM solution, but also causes problems due to the format in AD. Another common scenario is to manage Exchange. In the next video, we will take a look at that. We now have a way to get users created in AD. But what if we also would like FIM to make sure the new users get a mailbox in our Exchange environment? In FIM, there is a built-in way to manage Exchange by adding attributes to AD and then run the update recipient command to make Exchange handle the rest. We first need to enable this feature on our ADMA. The company is actually running Exchange 2013, but the UI in FIM is not yet updated with that option. We also need to add the attributes required for Exchange management. The required attributes depends on the Exchange version, but in my case the minimum would be home MDB, mail, mail nickname, MDB use defaults, target address, and MSEXE home server name. But there are other attributes as well that you might want to manage. As we said before, you need to remember to run a full import to get current values on the new attributes. The SVC FIM-MA account used in the ADMA needs to be a member of the Exchange Recipient Management Group. With that, we can create the rules we need to manage Exchange at the company. The policy is that all employees should have a mailbox, but contractors should only be mail-enabled users with an external email address. We solve this by creating 2 new rules that will add to our existing AD outbound rule. Using the outbound scoping filter, we create one for employees and one for contractors. The values we need for home MDB and MSEXE home server name you should get from your Exchange administrator, or you can look them up on existing users in AD. I will not show you all the detailed steps in this, since we have been creating synchronization rules before. After finishing the employees rule, we can continue and create the contractor rule. Importing the new rules and running synchronizations will verify that it all works as expected. In this case, we will get a typical error in FIM. This is because we are using an attribute in a function without checking if any value is present. We need to modify our rule to check using the isPresent function, or we will get this kind of null errors. Remember that the function names are case sensitive. Another way to manage exchange is to use a PowerShell MA instead of the built-in functionality in FIM. This will give us much more flexibility. We will look at using a PowerShell MA in section 6 when looking at an example on how to manage link. As we have seen, FIM contains a basic way of managing exchange settings. If we would like to do more advanced management, the built-in functionality will not be enough, and we would have to start using, for example, a PowerShell MA. We have now created our users in AD and even given them a mailbox. But what about when the employment ends? How do we delete the users in AD if we would like to? In the next and last video of this section, we will discuss this problem. When and how deletion of objects in FIM should happen is a very hard decision to make. In many organizations, deletes are not used since the policies for traceability dictates that deletes are not allowed. In FIM, we have several types of deletes to manage. We first need to decide if we are talking about deleting the objects in FIM or deleting them in some connected data source, like AD. If you would like the object to be deleted in FIM, you would look at two settings. First, the object deletion rules in the metaverse. We can make a declarative rule, for example saying that the user is no longer present in HR, it should be deleted. The default is that as long as there is a connector, the object will remain. We could also add a bit of code, some logic determining when deletes will happen. If we, for example, have a policy that the object should be deleted, char, we then need to set the second setting. This is to define on the FIM service MA that if the metaverse object is deleted, it should also be deleted in the FIM service. If we do not set this option, the object will reappear on the next import and sync from the FIM service. The same setting can be found on the AD MA, but here we also have the option to determine using code in a rule extension. If you are to work with AD deprovisioning, this is the best way to do it. That way, you can prevent disaster from happening when FIM starts to delete all users in AD due to an empty dataset from HR. At the company, the policy is that no user should be deleted in FIM or AD at the moment. The reason is traceability, which we will discuss later in section 7, where we'll talk about reporting. But the discussion on deprovisioning is not just deletes. It usually involves the management of users when the contract expires for some reason. We have already seen a part of this in managing the user account control attribute in AD. On TechNet, there is a great wiki article written by Carol Wopsher discussing the different options we have. You can find it using the short URL aka.ms/FIM-deprovisioning. This article also contains some code samples, getting you started when using code logic. At the moment, we also have the option to do active disconnects using the so-called expected rule entries in FIM. This requires that we use a synchronization rule that uses the MPR set and workflow triple. We will not go into this subject in detail since this is not the way I normally solve this. But if you take a look in my book or at TechNet articles on FIM, you will find plenty of information about this. The complexity of using this option is very hard to explain in the time frame allowed for this screencast. In this video, we have learned that deprovisioning is more than just deleting objects. Usually, we end up with not deleting users since the decisions are too hard to get. This was the last part of our initial section, where we have learned the basics around user management. Next up, we will look at groups. In this section, we will look at how groups will be managed within the company using FIM. In this first part, we will spend some time looking at the concepts of scopes and types in regards to groups. One of the problems with groups is that they look different in AD compared to FIM. Let's start by looking in AD. If you want to create a group in AD, you will see we get choices about scope and type. After making these choices, we will end up with having stored a value in the group type attribute. As with the user account control attribute we discussed in the previous section, here is a bitmap defining the scope and type of a group. We have to understand the values in this group type attribute in order to set it correctly in AD. There are articles like this one on MSDM that describes the different bits. There is, however, some mathematics involved that will make the actual value stored become negative, as we saw when we looked at the groups we created. This will result in a list of values that look like this. In FIM, however, groups are defined in a completely different way. The best way to look at it is to look at how the groups in FIM are defined in the schema. Looking at the bindings of the group resource, we'll see a number of attributes that are relevant when creating groups. The type attribute in FIM has 3 possible values, compared to the 2 you see in AD. The scope is the same as in AD. But in FIM, we also have the ability to create dynamic groups and have force approvals for joining groups. These settings are found in the membership locked and membership add workflow attributes. Membership locked is Boolean and controls whether the group is dynamic or static. The membership add workflow defines if, and if so, what kind of approval workflow to use. If we are to use owner approval, the group needs to have an owner. But we actually have 2 different attributes defining owners in the FIM scheme. We have both owner and displayed owner. The owner attribute is the one used for owner approval, and it is multi-value, making it possible to have multiple owners defined. The displayed owner is a single value attribute and corresponds to the single value attribute managed by in AD. This was just a quick overview of the differences in the schemas of AD and FIM. But it is vital that we have this understanding when we start to work with groups in FIM. First up is to import the organizational units in the HR system and create corresponding groups in AD. In our HR system, we do not have groups. We have organizational units. But the company would like FIM to make sure that these organizational units become security groups in AD that can be used to sign permissions. This means that we are actually not going to handle this as a group in FIM, but as organizational units. In the connection to AD, however, we will connect them as groups. As you might recall, we already have a member attribute on the HR org unit object. But in order to store the members, we need to add the member attribute to the organizational unit object class in FIM. We also need a way to store the manager of the organizational unit, so we'll add that attribute to the schema as well. I will also apply this change to the FIM service scheme, but I will not show you this since we have done it before in section 2. After making the changes to the FIM service schema and refreshing it, we'll need to add some new attributes to the FIM service MA in order to work with group-related attributes. They are not selected by default. In the next part, we will start using them while working with group resources in FIM. We can then create the inbound synchronization rule importing organizational unit information from HR to FIM. This we did in section 3, so I just show you the result. When creating the sync rule, we'll notice that there are attributes in HR that might be useful to have in FIM. One, for example, is the parent org or the HR type attribute. None of them are essential to our group scenario, but would be very good to have if we start exposing this information through the FIM portal in some self-service perspective. Before we can add the outbound rule, we need to add some attributes related to groups in the ADMA. Once the inbound rule is set up, we can create the outbound rule that will create the organizational units as groups in AD. Since we've done this many times before, I will speed up parts of this creation. The company, as many other organizations these days, is only using universal groups in AD. This makes the group type a fixed value for universal security group. When the rule's in place, we can import the rules, run the synchronizations, and verify that the pending export looks OK before we push the button and export the groups to AD. Organizational information is often imported from some kind of HR system. Once we have the attributes in place, it is easy to configure FIM to create the corresponding groups in AD. In the next video, we will look at how groups created in FIM are managed in AD. We just saw how organizational information in HR might be used to create groups based on that information. But that is only a small part of all the groups we would normally have in our AD. In this part, we will see how to configure FIM to accept groups created in FIM to be exported to AD. We have watched the schema in FIM, but how does it look when we create groups in FIM, and how do we configure the outbound rules to AD in order to create the correct type of group in AD? In the FIM portal, the default is to have separate views on distribution group and security groups. Let's take a look at creating a typical security group in FIM. The company needs a group with all contractors working in IT. It will be called IT contractors. Should be contractors working at the IT department. In order to use the information we have configured the FIM service MA
to export the parent org unit and employee type attributes to the FIM service. Since the company has its own set of employee types, the validation on the employee type binding has been adjusted to accept the values of the employee or contractor. Using the View Members button helps us decide if the criteria we are using is correct. The wizard automatically assigns the creator as owner, but we would like to assign the IT manager, John, to be the owner. Everything looks good by the time we submit the request to create this group, but we get an error. The reason for this error is that we are not allowed to use the new attribute in a filter. In order to use it in a filter, we need to add it to the filter permissions. There are two sets of permissions depending on who is allowed to use it. In our case, we need to add it to the administrator filter permission. We can then create our group. In order for this group to be provisioned, created in AD, we'll need to do a few things. We need to enable two MPRs to allow the sync engine to manage the group objects in FIM. One is to read, and the other is for creating and managing the group resources. We also need to update the FIM service MA to synchronize group attributes between the sync service and the FIM service. Finally, we need to create the outbound synchronization group. I recommend that you should have different rules for security and distribution groups, since they have different needs in most cases. Filtering this rule for security groups also makes the complexity of setting the group type attribute less complex, since we know the type. Importing and synchronizing the rules and group should give us the expected pending exports to AD. Using FIM, create our group makes the criteria-based groups available to you. We then have a great tool for creating the AD groups we need. In the next video, we will look at how to enable some self-service, allowing users like John to create groups themselves. Allowing not only administrators but even other users like managers and help desk to work with the groups using the FIM portal is something the company needs. First, we will look at allowing managers to work with distribution groups using the FIM portal. In the next section, we will look at some details on how to allow John, our manager, to access the portal. In this part, we will just consider those steps performed. When John looks at the portal, he does not have any distribution groups and would actually not be able to create one yet. What we wish to do is to allow managers to actually create distribution groups. First of all, we need a set that defines the users we would like to have the ability. We call this set Company Managers and make John a member. At the moment, the company has no way of automatically identifying if a user is a manager. In order to allow the managers to create distribution groups, we need to modify and enable some MPRs. First, we enable and modify the MPR, allowing managers to create distribution groups. Then we need to enable the MPR required for users to be able to join the groups and for owners to manage their group. Once that is done, John, our manager, can create a distribution list. John is now able to create first distribution group. The golfers group he creates requires owner approval. Allowing users to create their own distribution group is quite easy in Vim. In the next and last part of this section, on group management, we will look at the Outlook add-in and see how joining the group and approving the membership will look like at the company. In the previous video, we saw how John, our manager, was allowed to create distribution lists. In this part, Ken will join the list and John will approve it. But Vim offers a special add-in to Outlook that makes the approval process a lot smoother. In order to use the Outlook add-in, we need to install the Vim add-ins and extensions on the client used by John. These add-ins can be deployed using normal client deployment tools, and all the settings we configure can be managed using group policies. We will install both the Outlook add-in and the password extension that we will use in the section during self-service password reset. You will run into an error when installing the Outlook add-in if .NET Programmability is not installed as part of your Outlook deployment. During the configuration of the add-ins, just make sure that you fill in the correct values for the portals, the services, and the email addresses as we have configured them in the Vim environment. When users start Outlook, after installing the add-in, they will find a new menu called Groups. This can be used to join and leave groups. So what happens when Kent wants to join this group? Kent doesn't use Outlook, so he goes to the Vim portal and searches for groups. When Kent's request is submitted, we can see how his request is pending approval. This is because we now are waiting for the owner, John, to approve the request. John will now get an email about the request, and since John has the Outlook add-in installed, he actually has approve and reject buttons in the mail. John could also use the portal and see the pending request waiting for his approval. John, however, uses his Outlook and hits approve. He can also provide a reason for his approval and disappear as part of his request history. Once Vim has picked up his answer, the request is approved, and Vim sends John another email about the completed approval. Finally, Kent will have his request approved, and the group will appear in his list of groups. Vim has many benefits when working with groups, self-service being one of them. This was the last video in this section about groups. In the next section, we will look a little deeper into self-service and see how users can benefit from this in FIM. In this section, we will take a closer look at some self-service scenarios. First, we need to configure FIM to allow users to access the portal. In the previous section on group management, when the users accessed the portal, this first part was already configured. In order for a user to successfully authenticate against the FIM portal and the FIM service, the FIM service database needs to have some information about the user. There are 3 required attributes that need to be set: the account name, domain, and object SID. The easiest way to get this information is to import it from AD. What we do is we update the inbound synchronization and modify the FIM service MA attribute flow to make sure these 3 attributes are populated in the FIM service database. Once the information is imported to the FIM service, the user should be able to successfully authenticate against the FIM portal. But the user will not have any permissions in FIM, so he won't even be able to see the portal. We need to look at the MPRs and make sure we enable a couple of them to allow users access. The first MPR is the General Users Can Read Non-Administrative Resources. When you enable this MPR, you basically allow users to see objects in the portal. But with all of the general MPR enabled, the user will not be able to even find himself. So we also need to enable the MPR allowing users to see some information about themselves. If there are attributes in the target resource setting in this default MPR that you do not want users to be able to read, you would need to modify the attribute list. The users will then be able to find themselves, but if they try to read information about other users, they won't be able to do so. With that, users can now successfully authenticate and get a basic view of the FIM portal. If you add users manually to the FIM service, and there is no connection to AD for these objects, you need to manually set the object SID. You may do this for some admin accounts not in scope for your ADMA. Information about how to do that can be found on the internet. I, myself, use a small piece of PowerShell script that does the job. The biggest problem when allowing users to access the FIM portal is to get the required attributes populated on all users. In the next part, we will look at the most common self-service scenario in FIM, the self-service password reset feature. Self-service password reset is the feature in FIM that allows users to reset their own passwords and doesn't have to call helpdesk. Before we configure this feature, we should have installed the password reset registration and reset portals. Password registration portal will allow users to register for self-service password reset. Password reset portal can, after the user has been registered, be used when users need to reset their passwords. The company has also installed the FIM add-ins to their client computers, making it possible to have the ability to register and reset the passwords directly from the Windows logon screen. To enable this feature, we need to do some configurations FIM. First of all, the ADMA account, SVC FIM-MA, needs the permission in AD to reset passwords. The ADMA needs to be configured as a target for password management. I recommend that you enable the unlocking of accounts as part of this setting. Next, we need to allow the FIM service to make the call to the synchronization service to perform the reset. To do that, we add the FIM service account to the FIM sync browse and the FIM sync password set groups. Call from FIM service to perform the password change is done using WMI. So, if the FIM service and the FIM synchronization service are on different servers, you would need to allow for this call to work remotely. Remember that you need to restart the FIM service for this new group membership to apply. Finally, we need to configure the FIM service MPRs required for this to work. But the MPRs will use some sets that we need to look at. The first one is the password reset users set. This set by default contains all users. So if we use this, everyone will be enabled for SSPR. The company, however, has decided to only enable this for employees. So we modify this set to only contain employees. We then need to decide how the users should authenticate when they try to reset their passwords. FIM 2010 R2 offers 3 different ways to do this. One is the question and answer gate. The other 2 is using one-time passwords, sent either using email or SMS. The default in the authentication workflow present out of the box is the Q&A gate. The company has decided to use the Q&A gate. We need to configure the Q&A gate to have the proper settings and the proper question. The company has decided to only ask one question, asking the users to create the personal PIN to use. Once the configuration is finished, we can enable the SSPR feature by enabling 3 MPRs. If you have defined your own set of users instead of using the default password reset user set, you would also need to duplicate or modify these MPRs to refer to your custom set. I have worked on a project where different groups of users use different methods for self-service password reset. This requires duplicating all of the sets, workflows, and MPRs involved to make it work. John, being an employee, can now register for SSPR by either using the password registration portal or the add-in. Since the add-in is installed, John will receive a prompt to register for SSPR the next time he logs on to his computer. Following the registration process, he can then successfully register for SSPR. If later on John forgets his password, he can either use the password reset portal or the little link on his logon dialog. SSPR is really very easy to get started with. Adding users to the sets gradually makes it possible to have a small group of pilot users before we enable the feature for all users. In the next part, we will look at allowing the users with another self-service scenario by allowing them to modify their own attributes. Allowing users to maintain some of their attributes is not complicated from a FIM perspective. but usually involves long discussions around processes and policies within organizations. The company has realized that high data quality of some attributes are best obtained if the users manage these themselves. The first attribute they have decided to configure for self-service is the mobile phone. First, we need to decide if this is valid for all users or only some users. At the company, they decided that this should be enabled for all users. That means they can use the built-in set all people for this. However, if we look at that set, we see that the definition is a bit wrong, because the definition all users the company intended does not include service accounts and other user objects. The company needs to create a set that holds the user objects matching the intention of the policy. Let's create a set company all users, defining a company user as someone being either an employee, or contract. We now have a decent set we can use in the MPR, allowing the self-service of the mobile phone attribute. Then we create the MPR, allowing company users to update the mobile phone attribute of their own. Using the relative to resource ID is the same as saying themselves. When a user now looks at his profile in the FIM portal, he will see that the mobile phone attribute is writable, not only readable. Finalize this setting, you would likely also add these attributes to this synchronization flow to allow the value to be visible in AD or your Exchange address book. Allowing users to manage attributes of their own, or allowing managers to update some attributes of their direct reports, is often a good way to achieve high data quality within FIM. In the next part, we will look at allowing help desk to manage the users using the FIM portal. A common request is to allow help desk to manage the users in FIM in some aspect. The company has decided to allow help desk to modify a few values on users to help solve some typical help desk calls. The first thing we need is a set defining the help desk users. Lately, a new user, Jane, started working at the company in the help desk unit. In FIM, we have the organizational references we can use to define users in the help desk unit. Currently, when Jane goes to the FIM portal, she cannot find any other users. Not strange, since we have no MPR allowing that. The company wants help desk to be able to enable and disable users using the FIM portal. If you recall earlier sections, you might remember that this was controlled by the company active attribute. So what we need to do is to allow help desk users to modify the company active attribute on other users. But first, they would need to be able to find them. This can be done by giving them read access to other users. For simplicity, I'll give helpdesk the read permission to all attributes on the company users. Now, when Jane searches, she will find the users. But looking at one of them, the active attribute is not present. In the next section, we will look at the details on how we modify the forms in FIM. Right now, we'll just accept the fact that it has been done for Jane to see the company active attribute. The next step is to create the MPR, allowing helpdesk to modify the active attribute. The requester is helpdesk, and the target is the company users, and so far only the active attribute. A typical addition to this MPR would be to configure a workflow action to send a notification to the user's manager about the change. Now helpdesk will be able to modify the value, but in order for the change to have some real impact, we need to change the precedence on this attribute in the synchronization service metaverse. Let's follow Jane as she disables the user Ken and how the synchronization of that event moves from FIM service to AD. Jane can just as easily enable Ken if he, for example, returns for another job at the company. One key reason for using FIM to do this is that this action from Jane will be recorded in FIM's request database. And, as we will see in section 7, it will also be stored long-term in the data warehouse used by FIM reporting. In the request, we can see who did what and the MPR allowing the request. Allowing helpdesk to perform some corrective actions on users in FIM will increase the security and traceability on the event and allow us to add things like notifications or authorizations to the event. This was the last part in the self-service section. In the next section, we will look at how this experience can be enhanced by modifying the user interface in FIM. In this section, I will show you some examples on customization. The first video is about modifying the portal look and feel. In the previous section, we allowed helpdesk to enable and disable accounts using the portal. But to expose the new custom attribute we used, the company had made some changes to the UI. Changes to the forms used in the FIM portal are made by modifying the Resource Control Display Configuration, RCDC. In this case, the company needs to add the active attribute to the configuration for user editing. As soon as you start making modifications to the RCDCs, you need some way of managing the versions and be able to restore to earlier version of the forms. Any XML editor will actually work to modify the RCDC, but the syntax is not that easy to understand. So make sure you read the Microsoft TechNet articles available. Before the RCDC is visible in the UI, you import the new configuration and run IS reset to load it. Once the new RCDC is imported, the modification will show in the UI. In the home page resources, we can add or modify things we see in the main frame of the portal. The portal configuration can be used to modify the logo in the upper left corner. The company has decided to replace the default with their own. You can do this by modifying the path in the portal configuration or just replace the logo.png file. The left part of the portal is called the navigation bar and is controlled by the navigation bar resources. The parent order and order attributes define where they will show up in the UI. A very important thing to look at is the usage keyword. Basic UI means that it will show for all users if you use the default MPR to allow access to the portal. Removing the basic UI keyword will make it disappear for normal users. This is why the portal looks different for administrators compared to normal users. The final thing we will look at is the search scopes. The company has defined that the default all users search scope should display different columns than the default ones. By modifying the search scope, you can define the columns listed in the result. There are many options when it comes to modifying the look and feel of the FIM portal. In this part, we have only been able to show you a few examples. In the next video, we will look at adding custom workflow activities. After doing the basic stuff in FIM, you will likely run into scenarios where a custom workflow activity might be useful. Before you start a development project to build your own custom activity, you really should look around and see if it has already been done. If we look at the activities we can pick while creating a workflow, we find that it's a very limited list. A typical example is the Granfeld workflow activity library you can find on Codeplex. Codeplex is open source, and you can use it at your own risk. This library contains some useful activities. Before we can add the workflow library, we need to address a bug in FIM. For some reason, the product team has misspelled a word in one MPR. The MPR in question is the Administrator's Control Configuration Related Resources. In this MPR, the word authorization is misspelled. We need to correct this before we can register any custom authorization activities. If we don't, the registration will fail since there is no MPR allowing the administrator to perform the registration. Installing one of the activities in the custom workflow library will make it possible for us to use it in our workflows and MPRs. The company will use this lookup activity to update the department attribute of a user to reflect the display name of the organizational unit. In order to do that, they need to define a workflow activity that does this. Then they need an MPR that triggers the activity whenever the organizational unit is changed. Notice how this MPR is not used to allow permissions, just to trigger a workflow. And now, for example, if Ken would move to help desk, this MPR would trigger the update of the department attribute. As you can see, this should have been in place to begin with in order for this to happen on our current users. But this can be solved by creating a set transition MPR to run our workflows on current users. If we look at the request made, we can see that the update of the organizational unit attribute to helpdesk was allowed by the MPR, allowing the sync engine to perform the operation, but also triggered the MPR updating the department attribute. This in turn causes a new request to update the department attribute of the user. Using custom workflows, we can extend FIM to perform many actions and operations as part of our identity management. Using general activities like PowerShell or code run makes it possible to solve almost any problem. In the next video, we will look at another option we have when trying to modify data. We will look at rules extensions. There are occasions when the built-in functionality or even workflow activities doesn't give you the solution. Many times, the best and easiest way is to look at using classic rules extensions. The company has decided to use FIM to detect if accounts have been used or not. In Active Directory, you can look at the last logon timestamp to indicate when the account was last used. And although this is exposed in some interfaces as date times, it's actually stored as an integer. In FIM, however, we need to store the date time values in a specific format to use it. The company first needs to add a new attribute to the FIM schemas and make it visible the way we have already seen in earlier sections on this screencast. Notice that in the synchronization service schema, this is stored as a string. Once we have extended the schema, we add the attribute to the list of attributes in the ADMA and try to add to our synchronization rule. The problem we run into is that we have the wrong data types involved. One common solution to this problem is to implement a classic rules extension in the attribute flow on the management agent. By using the advanced mapping type, we can define a piece of code to be run when this attribute flow is called. Since we also have need for a rules extension, a DLL is defined in the Extensions tab. The DLL the synchronization engine will call, however, needs to be built, and some code to handle the flow is required. Synchronization Service Manager can actually help you generate the basic solution you need to build your DLL. If you have Visual Studio installed on the FIM server, you can edit it locally, but typically you will not have Visual Studio on your production FIM server. To a separate machine where no FIM is installed will make it necessary to copy the meta directory services exDLL and add as reference. You will also need to adjust the output path. Opening the solution in Visual Studio, you can then add the logic to convert the integer stored in AD to the datetime format used in FIM. The part we are looking at is the map attributes for import. The code you see is the minimum required, and typically I would add some error handling as well to the code. After building the DLL, it needs to be copied into the extensions folder of your FIM synchronization service. Synchronizing will now use the code to convert the integer to datetime format usable within FIM. In FIM service, we can now use the last logon attribute in our policies. First, we need to add the attribute to the filter permissions if we are to use it as a criteria when defining a set. To make use of this, the company creates a set using the last logon as criteria, defining a set that will hold all users with last logon more than 60 days ago. The set can then be used in a transition MPR that notifies help desk. The action activity could as easily be configured to inactivate the account automatically. For some attribute flows, classic rules extensions are the best solution. In the last video of this section, we will look at a way to solve the need for a custom management agent. There are many situations when you would like FIM to connect to a system and is missing a management agent. In such cases, a PowerShell MA might be the solution. The company has decided to use FIM to manage the user's link accounts. They add a new Boolean attribute to the schema that will decide if a user is enabled for link or not. But the problem is that there is no management agent that can be used to enable or disable a user's in link. Link administrators usually use PowerShell to operate link, so the company decided to implement a PowerShell management agent. At the time I wrote this, Microsoft is yet to release their new PowerShell management agent, so the company instead decided to use the one from Søren Gronfeldt. After installing this, you get a new option when creating a new MA. You then follow the instructions to configure this MA pretty much the same way you do regular MAs. This particular MA wants you to point it to the PowerShell scripts you plan to use. The first one is the schema script. The schema script contains the schema used in this MA. The other scripts are the action script to perform different operations. The rest of the MA is just defaults. We now need to have some PowerShell skills to actually write these scripts to use. The company imports the users from AD and then intends to join them to the metaverse and modify the link status as an outbound flow. So no projection or provisioning is involved in this MA. In the import script, they only import employee users since they are the only ones that are using link. Example scripts for this MA can be found on my blog among other places. When the import script is done, we should be able to create a run profile and import users. Initially, the company is not importing anything, so to just do the join, they configure this on the MA itself. The export script in this case connects to the link server using remote PowerShell. The only actual action is to link enable or link disable the users based on one value. The only thing missing now is the synchronization rule that uses the new Boolean attribute to decide if a user should be link enabled or not. Since the import is filtered for only employees, we do the same for the synchronization rule. Importing the new sync rule and enabling yon for link, we can see how the preview shows how this will send the expected value to the export script. Using generic adapters like the PowerShell example we saw in this video, we can often solve many tricky connection problems in FIM. This was the last video of this customization section. Next up is something completely different: reports. The reporting feature in FIM 2010 R2 gives us the ability to store and view information about changes made to identities and groups for a long time. The storage we will be using is the System Center Service Manager's data warehouse. We will not cover the setup of the SCSM infrastructure in this screencast. We will just look at the things required to get FIM reporting working. Before you add the reporting feature in FIM, it is required that you have installed the System Center Service Manager management console on the FIM server itself. For the IAM admin to be able to add the management packs for FIM, he must be member of the SCSM admin group. We are adding the reporting feature and not installing it during initial setup. We will run into an error during setup if we use SCSM 2012 and haven't updated our FIM to at least 4.1.3451. So if you are running SP1, you need to first update your FIM. The failure is that the installer will detect a missing hotfix that is not available when using SCSM 2012. Once updated, you can successfully add the reporting feature. The next step is to wait. What will happen now is that the newly installed management packs will be synchronized within the System Center Service Manager. Looking at the MP Sync job status using our SCSM console, we can see the status of the MP Sync job. Once the initial MP Sync job has finished, we need to run a configuration script on the SCSM data warehouse server. This is required in order to fully support the FIM reporting, pruning and grooming processes, which will maintain the data integrity in the data warehouse over time. If you run this script while the MP Sync job is running, it will fail, since the configuration made by the script cannot be made while the MP Sync job is running. Once the MP Sync job has finished, we can run the script successfully. The tricky part of installing the FIM reporting feature is to actually get SCSM up and running. Once in place, adding the reporting feature is pretty straightforward. In the next part, we will look at how to get data from FIM to the data warehouse in order to actually get some data in the reports. To get the actual data from FIM to the data warehouse, we need to get some jobs started on FIM. First, we need to get an initial sync of data started. Once that is finished, the idea is to only run delta synchronization of data from FIM to the data warehouse. Once the job is running, you need to wait for it to finish before we trigger the incremental sync. In the FIM portal, the reporting jobs are a special resource. As long as it is running, you should take it easy. If your environment is large and contains a lot of data, this initial reporting job may take several hours to complete. Once the initial job completes, we can start the incremental job. If everything works as expected, this is all you need to do to get your data into the data warehouse and view it using the reports. The data in the reports will be old, since the transfer from FIM to the data warehouse is a scheduled SQL Server agent job. If you would like to change the schedule to get more up-to-date information transferred, you can modify the schedule on this SQL Server agent job. When the information is transferred to the data warehouse server, it will not show in reports until the so-called ETL process has been running on the DB server. you can look at the jobs included in the ETL process using the SESM Management Console. The steps you should look at in the data warehouse jobs are the extract, transform, and load jobs. The default setting is that these jobs will update data once a day. For reporting purposes, this is fine, and you should not try to configure them to run too often, since that will place heavy load on the data warehouse servers. The reporting data is supposed to show historical information. Typically, you can view data from yesterday, but not from today, in the reports. In the next video, we will do just that. Take a look at the reports. The FIM reports can be viewed using different interfaces. FIM comes with a few default reports that can be used to track historical changes in FIM. Using the SESM console, we can access the reporting node and from there start the report we would like to see. As you can see, there are 8 reports out of the box. Let's look at the user history report. What I get is that there is no data available for this report. This is common during the development of your FIM solution. The reason is that the default filter for the report is to only look a few days back, and if nothing happened, there is no data. Another reason for empty reports is that the data warehouse jobs have not been running for some reason. We need to make sure the jobs are running. Once the jobs have processed the data, the report will contain the expected data. What do I see in the report then? Well, let's zoom in and look at some typical rows in the report. In this case, we have the user history report. It shows requests made to user objects. What you see is the request made when Jane disabled the user Ken. We see who was the affected user, what kind of operation was made, what attribute was involved, what's the new value, when was the request made. Finally, we can see who made the request and which MPR allowed this request to be made. Another option to look at the reports is to access the reports using the browser. Using the filtering capability in the reports, we can easily create a report about a specific user, for example. The FIM default reports give you the information required to meet the demands regarding traceability around your identity management solution. But the reports are only available for administrators. In the next video, we will allow managers to view selected reports. Allowing trusted personnel like managers to view the reports is sometimes useful. The company has decided that the user history report should be available to managers. The first thing we need to do is to modify the permissions on the reports. John tries to access the user history report, he will get a permission error. Administrator needs to access the report and modify the security setting on the report, allowing John access. Usually, this would be done using a group rather than the individual user. Once we have done that, John should be able to view the user history report. But we still have the problem of giving John a nice way to find this complex URL to the report he is allowed to access. If we look at the FIM portal as John, we can see that one way would be to add a link to the report but only make it visible to John. The idea is to put the link below the My Profile link
in the navigation bar. So we need to add a navigation bar resource. To give us the ability to only show this to John, we indent a new usage keyword called Manager UI. The position is 3.2 since the My Profile has 3.1. And then we need to add the URL for the user history report. When the navigation bar resource is finished, we need to create a set to define the resources with the Manager UI keyword. We already have a set containing the manager. A dynamic way to build the set is not available at the company, so for now it's kind of a manual set. Now we can define the MPR, allowing the managers to view the resources with the Manager UI keyword. John will now have a nice link in the FIM portal, making it easy for him to access the FIM user history report. Making the FIM reports available through the FIM portal is one way of making them easy to access for administrators or other users in need of accessing them. This was the final part of this section on reporting. And this section was the last one around synchronization and user management using the FIM synchronization service, the FIM service, and the FIM portal. The next section is about the special feature in FIM allowing for certificate management.
This section is about the somewhat odd member of the FIM product family, the FIM certificate management. The company has decided to follow the best practice and install the CM part on a separate server. But before we start installing FIM CM, we need some DNS records, certificates, and some service accounts. FIM CM has a portal that will use the URL https://cm.company.com. So we need to add that to the DNS and request the certificate to be used by the SSL site. FIM CM uses a total of 7 service accounts. In the next part, we will look a bit closer to the use of each of them. First, let's see the account used by the IIS application pool. This account needs to have the SPN for the CM portal. It also needs to be trusted for delegation against the certificate authority we will use to issue these certificates. Then we'll create the other 6 accounts. The FIM CM agent. This account is used by FIM CM to sign data. It is also the default account used to encrypt data. The FIM CM enrollment agent. This account requests certificates on behalf of a user account. These requests are signed using the FIM CM enrollment agent certificate. The FIM CM key recovery agent. This account recovers archived private keys from the CA or HSM. The FIM CM authorization agent. This account determines user rights and permissions for users and groups. The FIM CM CA manager account. This account performs CA management activities. And finally, the FIM CM service account. This account will be used by the FIM CM update service. With the service accounts created, we will look at 2 other prerequisites for installing FIM CM. The .NET Framework 3.5 needs to be added unless already installed. Then IIS with some additional components are required. This can be done using the Server Manager or using PowerShell. We will do some more preparations in the next part, but for now we can install the FIM-CM component. The installation is very simple and we can use all default values. The prerequisites are much more complicated than the installation of FIM-CM. In the next video, we will look at the initial configuration of FIM-CM. In the previous part, we installed the prerequisites and the FIM-CM bits. We will now look at the initial configuration. It consists of a number of steps with many chances of making mistakes. The first step is to extend the AD schema to support the permissions and the objects required by FIM-CM. The steps to extend the schema is to first copy the schema files from the FIM-CM media. If you copy from the FIM DVD, you might need to remove the read-only attribute. We then need to update the script and the schema file to reflect the current AD forest. Using Notepad, we can replace the example domain with our own. We need to both modify the VB script and the LDIF file. We can then run the VB script to update the schema. FIM-CM uses a SQL database, and we add a SQL alias as with the other FIM components we have added. Later, when we run the configuration wizard in FIM-CM, we will select the certificate template to use when requesting the certificate used by the 3 agent accounts in FIM-CM. Best practice is to create new templates for each of these. The FIM-CM agent account needs a user certificate. The FIM-CM enrollment agent needs an enrollment agent certificate. And since the company is not using a hardware security module, we need to be able to export private key for backup purposes. And finally, the FIM-CM key recovery agent needs a key recovery certificate. Once we have created them, we need to enable them on a CA. As a best practice, you should also enable SSL and require SSL on the certificate management application in IIS. We can now run the configuration wizard. But remember that the user running the wizard needs to be a domain admin. Running the wizard is quite straightforward until we get to the questions about the agent accounts. If we happen to click on Next, the accounts will be created and the certificate will be requested beyond our control and without our consent. You have to remember to uncheck the Use the FIM-CM default settings and select Custom Counts. You'll have to modify the information and select Use an existing user for each agent. Verify your settings before you click on Next and move to the Certificates settings. On the Certificate step in the wizard, we select the corresponding certificate template we created earlier. If you were using a hardware security module, you would have used manual configuration. Specify the SMTP server that should be used if processes using mail will be used later. Click on Configure and the configuration will be applied. It is not uncommon for errors to occur. Since there are many parameters, especially on the agent settings that might be wrong. If you get errors, you need to restart the wizard and do it all over again, but using the correct settings. Since the company is not using a hardware security module to manage the certificates used by the FIM-CM agents, we should now log on to the server as each agent and make sure we get a backup of the private keys for each agent certificate. I only show the CM agent, but remember to do this for the key recovery and enrollment agent as well. Before we can verify that the application is working, the IIS needs to be configured to use the application pool account. Verify, we try to access the FIM-CM portal. We have seen how to prepare for and run the FIM-CM configuration wizard. Challenge when running the wizard is to keep track of all agent accounts and the certificate templates. The next part before we can start using FIM-CM is to configure the CA server. The FIM-CM will use an enterprise CA to do the actual issuing of certificates. But in order for that to work, the CA needs some configuration. First, we need to give the CA server access to the database used by FIM-CM. The CA server is given the CLM app role on the database. We then need to run the FIM-CM setup on the CA server and install the FIM-CM CA files. Please note that the setup requires that the operating system is enterprise or data center. In Server 2012, the enterprise CA running on standard edition of the operating system should work for FIM-CM, but the installer has a bug and checks for the operating system version as well. So if you are using Server 2012 for your CA, you need to run it on Data Center edition of Server 2012. What we installed is called modules in the CA. Policy module needs to be configured with information about the certificate FIM-CM will use to sign the requests. The certificate currently used by FIM-CM can be found in the web.config file on the FIM-CM server. The next module we need to configure is the exit module. Here we need to configure the connection string that the CA exit module will use to report back to the FIM-CM database. As with our other FIM servers, we use a SQL alias on the CA server as well. For the change to take effect, we need to restart the certificate services. And to verify it all worked, you should check the event log for errors. I also make a habit of checking the certificate authority table in the FIM certificate management database to make sure the CA has successfully registered itself in the database. Your CA setup is usually not a problem, but a small typo in the connection string might be hard to detect when configuring the CA. We are now ready to start configuring the FIM-CM environment to solve the problem that the company wants solved. In the next video, we will allow the manager John to issue a smart card to the consultant Ken. The company wants to allow managers like John to issue smart cards for contractors like Ken. FIM-CM allows this kind of self-service, but requires some rather complex permission settings. One of the things we need to do is to install the FIM-CM client software on John's workstation. Using 64 or 32-bit version depends on the version of Internet Explorer John uses. Be aware that even though the operating system is 64-bit, it might be using a 32-bit version of IE. We then need to configure the permissions and build a policy to allow John to issue a smart card on behalf of Ken. In this demo, I will use the user accounts directly to make it easier to follow. But in reality, we would create groups for each role and make John and Kent members of each group. On the service connection point in AD, John needs to be assigned the administrative permissions he needs. John then needs the permission on Kent's AD object to act as enrollment agent. We then need to create a certificate template that we intend to use for this scenario. In our case, the template should contain the smart card logon usage. So we create a duplicate of the smart card logon template. The company is issuing the contractor smart cards for 3 months. If John wants his contractor to be able to use it longer, he will just renew the certificate for his contract. On this template, both the user Ken and the enrollment agent John will need to have enroll permission. In FIM-CM, we can now define the profile template that will define how the enrollment, renewals, etc. will be done. We start off by making a copy of one of the templates available and giving it a descriptive name. We then define that it should use our newly created certificate template. Remember to remove the one you are not using. As you can see, the profile template has a lot of settings, so we will only look at those relevant to our case. Within the smart card configuration, I recommend you start off by using a manual PIN and not to diversify the admin key. If you diversify the admin key, the smart card can only be managed using FIM-CM from here on. For each workflow step listed in the navigator on the left, we can then define who and how each step should be performed. Enroll policy is essential in our scenario. First, we require it to use an enrollment agent. Then give John the initiate enroll request and the enroll agent permission within the profile template. The last setting is one that you easily miss. You need to assign permission to the profile template object in AD as well, allowing both John, the enrollment agent, and Ken, the target user, enroll permission. Finally, all pieces are in place, and John can try accessing the FIM-CM portal. By doing this through his client machine with the FIM-CM client software installed, he is now able to issue a smart card to Ken using the portal. Once the smart card is finished, he can hand it over to Ken along with the PIN. If we have the FIM-CM client software installed on Ken's workstation as well, he will be able to use the FIM-CM portal to manage his smart card, like changing the PIN. FIM-CM requires many small configuration steps in order to allow for self-service management of certificates. But the flexibility you gain is very high, and you also get a secure way of allowing users to manage smart card. This was the last part of the last section in this screencast. I hope you have enjoyed watching. If you have any follow-up questions, I urge you to visit my blog at kunab.com, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you for watching this screencast.